Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking at an extract from Luke's version of the Little Apocalypse and thinking about what it means to address the challenges and urgency of the call of discipleship. Before we look at any of this, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. After a very long journey, parts of which we've explored in recent weeks, Jesus had finally arrived in the city of Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. And he'd been involved in a series of free controversies with leaders of some of the different groups within the lively Judaism of the day, documented in chapter 20, verses 1 through to 40. The events in today's passage take place in what we now call Holy Week, and the cross very much looms large in what Jesus has to say in today's text. And our passage is part of a bigger section, as I've already hinted, that runs from chapter 21, verse 5 through to verse 36, sometimes known as the Lucan Apocalypse, or Luke's version of the Little Apocalypse. And in this section, Jesus assures his friends, his disciples, his followers, that the tribulations that are going to come about before the kingdom comes in all of its fullness are not actually the end of things, and that they must occur prior to the coming kingdom. We might look for another reference for that at Acts 14, verse 22. Now, the action in today's reading takes place in the Jerusalem temple, and that's a really important place. It's where Luke's gospel begins and ends. Indeed, it's where the action really kind of picks up in the book of Acts as well. And it was the heart of Israel's religious and political life. In those days, the two aspects were very much bound together. It was also believed to be the dwelling place of God. And indeed, reference is made to that in Luke 13, verses 34 to 36. It was undergoing a period of rapid expansion and redevelopment at this time, instigated by Herod the Great, who was the puppet ruler of Judea. And its stonework and beautiful adornments referenced in this passage were part of that redevelopment project. So in this text, we have Jesus coming to the end of his public ministry and indeed his life, and facing the impending reality of crucifixion. And we've also got the disciples, including but not limited to the 12. And they were speaking with Jesus in this passage in the temple complex. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and forms volume 1 of a two-part work with the book of Acts. A couple of things to note about Luke's context, which I think come in to today's passage. Firstly, by the time we get to 80 to 85, church and synagogue were very much parting company, and there was a lot of hostility from one to the other and vice versa. Luke's community, predominantly based in Syria, a predominantly Gentile community, were facing persecution from the occupying Roman authorities. And the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, with devastating effects on the people of Israel. As I say, it had been so much at the heart of their national identity. So all of this feeds in to today's apocalyptic text. Now, it's also worth looking at various other passages along the way, but in particular noting Luke 19 verses 41 to 44, where Jesus declares that if his disciples were silenced, the very stones of the temple would shout aloud when he was testifying against those who would reject him. And also it's useful to take a look and compare today's passage with Mark 13 verses 1 to 8 and Matthew 24 verses 1 to 14 as two earlier versions mirroring the content of today's text. Now, having found a bit of respite from controversy and argument and debate, Jesus was in the temple complex with his disciples, talking with them. It's not clear where the remark in verse 5 about the beauty and adornment of the temple and its glorification of God comes from, whether it's from a disciple or whether it's somebody else in passing. Jesus has overheard them. But either way, that comment about the temple was the catalyst for what followed thereafter. Now, because it was at the heart of Israel's faith, the temple was probably the obvious place for the conflict between Jesus and Israel's ruling religious elite to play itself out. And the temple's status had become somewhat ambiguous. Certainly it was grand and dramatic and did point to the glory of God. But it also pointed to the glory of the despotic Herod, who was enhancing it so that people would think well of him when he'd never been fully accepted as a leader of Jewish people. And the destruction that was wreaked on not just the temple but on Jerusalem was brutal and devastating. It's not surprising that many Jewish people believed that that time represented the end of the world as they knew it. And the destruction of the temple, along with looking ahead to the coming of the Son of Man, are two key themes that we have in the background here. Now in verse 6, Jesus tells his disciples that none of the stones making up the temple, despite their vastness, would be left. Everything would be thrown down when the time came. And we know that Jesus' death was part of God's divine timetable and the events surrounding that. All of that's explained for us in chapter 17, verses 22 through to 37. But there is a danger when we come to apocalyptic literature like this, that it gets taken literally and people look to say, oh, that event in the world corresponds to this and so forth. Jesus warns against that and attempting to map out God's timetable in terms of our human events and agendas. The disciples in verse 7 need to be warned against some of those risks when they ask Jesus when all of this will happen and what signs they need to look out for. And Jesus' response to them can be divided up into three subsections. So firstly, in verse 8, Jesus warns his followers about false messiahs, false prophets coming along and saying, I am he, and drawing them away from Jesus. And indeed, he tells them to be wary of people who claim to know the time at which God will act. So that's the first little section. In verses 9 through to 11, Jesus points to the tribulations that must occur before the end comes, before the kingdom comes in all of its fullness, before God renews the heavens and the earth. And these tribulations include wars and various natural disasters and terrible heavenly portents. Now, Jesus, in using this kind of language, is drawing on apocalyptic literature from the Hebrew scriptures. For example, Daniel 11 verses 20, 25 and 44, and Joel 2 verses 28 to 32. There's just a couple of examples. And the point of using this kind of language is to reassure the disciples, to say that even in the most extreme of circumstances you could possibly imagine, God is faithful and God is with you. That's the point of this imagery. And then in verses 12 through to 19, Jesus tells them about persecutions and troubles that must befall them before these heavenly portents and disasters and so on can happen. Now, in that latter section, in verses 12 through to 19, that's where I think, in the reference to conflict with the synagogue, we need to keep in mind the divergence between church and synagogue. And in the reference to kings and rulers, we find the backdrop of Roman persecution against Luke's community. And I think that's therefore what's behind the imagery that we find in the latter part of verse 12. So it's very much speaking into Luke's community's situation. Now in verse 13, Jesus speaks of the opportunity to testify. And that is a possibility that the disciples might be able to witness to him and what he's about and what God has done and is doing through Jesus. Because, as Jesus goes on to say in verses 14 and 15, there'll be gifted words from him, from the Holy Spirit, that cannot be contradicted or overruled. And that might take us back to chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, where there's the promise that the Holy Spirit will give the disciples the right words to say in tough spots. Now, this pattern of witnessing using words given from God, something we see that the disciples were again reminded of a calling to do in Acts 1 verse 8, comes through in various examples in that latter book. For example, in chapter 4 verses 13 to 14 and chapter 16 verses 6 to 7. We will see, if we read on from Luke into Acts, the kind of challenging situations that those early disciples would go on to face and the cost that they paid for being faithful to God. Now, Jesus does not shy away in this section, in verses 16 and 17 in particular, in letting his disciples know the extent to which they are going to be reviled. It talks about being hated by all, and it talks about being rejected and betrayed by those closest to them, even perhaps to the point of being betrayed to their deaths. And yet, in verse 18, where Jesus uses a proverb about hairs on one's head not being touched, there is resurrection hope, and there's the motif of God's protection. In other words, even in those really difficult situations, God will be with them. In using that imagery, Jesus evokes connections to the Hebrew scriptures, for example, from 1 Samuel 14 verse 45 or 2 Samuel 14 verse 11. The Holy Spirit, as we learn in verse 19, will give the disciples the power to endure the suffering that they may well encounter for their faithfulness. So overall then, the passage picks up on the really important theme of creation's groaning and birth pangs, as it were, as it longs to become whole. Might make us think of Romans 8, verses 22 to 23. Jesus' death and resurrection, this passage makes clear, is a major cosmic act and an absolutely central part of God's making whole of all that God has made. But there will be turbulence, there will be challenges. It's not easy to be a disciple. So, like all apocalyptic passages, this is difficult to grapple with, but there's also a lot of richness here. And as we come towards the end of one church year and prepare ourselves once again to enter into the season of Advent, there's a lot to contemplate here. And we now turn to some of those things in our questions for this week.